The camera lights hit my face so hard I could barely see past them, but I could still make out the outline of my father in the audience, his hand frozen halfway to his mouth, the same hand that had pointed at me just 4 hours earlier and said, "You're just a lowly teacher." My name is Emily Carter. I'm 29 years old, and tonight, of all nights, was the first time my parents ever saw me. Not really saw me. Not the version they introduced at dinner parties or dismissed at family gatherings. The real me. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because if you had walked into our house at exactly 6:12 p.m. that evening, you would have seen something very different. You would have seen a long oak dining table set for 8, polished to the point where the chandelier reflected like glass across its surface, my mother adjusting the placement of the wine glasses like we were hosting a senator, and my older sister Sophia scrolling through her phone, laughing at something someone in her firm had just texted her. And then there was me, standing by the kitchen island in a dress I bought on clearance for $39.99, holding a casserole dish I'd spent 2 hours making, already knowing how the night would go. It always went the same way. Someone would ask what I was doing these days. My mother would answer before I could. "Emily teaches," she'd say with that careful smile, like she was apologizing without saying the words. And then my father would lean back in his chair, sip his drink, and add something just sharp enough to land. That night, he didn't even wait for the question. He looked straight at me in front of everyone and said it like a fact. "Let's be honest here. Sophia's building a real career. Emily's, well, she's just a lowly teacher." There it was. Not shouted. Not dramatic. Just dropped onto the table like it belonged there. A label. A verdict. Sophia didn't look up. My mother didn't correct him. Someone chuckled. I smiled. I always smiled. Because correcting them never worked. Explaining never worked. For years I told myself it didn't matter. That what I did, standing in a classroom with 30 kids, some of them hungry, some of them exhausted, some of them already convinced they didn't matter, was enough. I told myself I didn't need their approval. But there's a difference between not needing something and never having it at all. And in that moment, sitting there with my hands folded in my lap, I felt it again. That familiar tightening in my chest. That quiet question I'd been asking myself since I was 16. What would it take for them to see me differently? The answer, it turns out, was already in my bag, sitting on the chair beside me, in the form of a phone that had buzzed 3 times during dinner while I pretended not to notice. I didn't check it until I stepped outside, the cool evening air hitting my face as the door clicked shut behind me. 3 missed calls. 1 voicemail. 1 text. "We're ready for you. Live segment confirmed. 9 p.m. I stared at the screen for a long second, my reflection faint in the glass, my heart beating just a little faster. Inside, I could still hear the low hum of conversation, the clink of silverware, my father's voice carrying through the walls like it always did. I should have gone back in. I should have sat down, finished dinner, let the night pass like every other night. That's what they expected. That's who they thought I was. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that by the time the clock hit 9, the same words they used to shrink me were about to echo in a very different room, in front of a very different audience, and for the first time in my life I wasn't going to correct them. I was going to let the world do it for me. I did not go back inside right away. I stood there on the front porch, staring at my phone like it belonged to someone else, like that message had been sent to the wrong person, because nothing about my life, nothing about the way my family saw me, matched the words on that screen. Live segment confirmed. 9 p.m. I checked the time. 6:47. A little over 2 hours. Inside, laughter broke out, loud and sharp, the kind that always followed one of my father's stories, and for a second I pictured myself walking back in, sliding into my chair, pretending none of this existed. That would have been easier. It had always been easier to stay small, to stay predictable, to stay exactly who they needed me to be so they could keep their version of the story intact. Emily, the quiet one. Emily, the one who never quite measured up. Emily, the teacher. I exhaled slowly and opened the voicemail. A producer's voice, fast, professional, slightly rushed. "Emily, this is Rachel from Channel 7. We are locking this segment. We need you at the studio by 8:15. Car service can be there in 20 minutes if you confirm." I listened to it twice. Then a third time. Channel 7. The same network my father watched every morning while reading financial news on his tablet. The same network Sophia had once called relevant. My thumb hovered over the screen. I could already hear the questions if I told them. What is this about? Why did you not mention it? Is this even serious? And underneath all of it, the real message. You are not the kind of person who gets called onto television. I typed one word. Confirm. The reply came almost instantly. Car arriving in 18 minutes. 18 minutes. I looked down at what I was wearing. Simple dress. Flat shoes. No makeup beyond what I had put on that morning before school. Nothing about me looked like someone who belonged on television. Then again, nothing about me had ever looked like someone my family respected either, and that had never stopped them from defining me. A car pulled up to the curb sooner than I expected. A black sedan with tinted windows, engine idling quietly like it had been waiting for me all along. I glanced back at the house one more time. Through the window, I could see my father leaning back in his chair, glass in hand, completely at ease, completely certain of who I was. I reached for the door handle, paused, then let go. I walked down the steps instead. Each step felt heavier than it should have, like I was stepping out of something I had been standing in for years. The driver stepped out, opened the back door and gave a small nod. Emily. I nodded back. Yes. He did not ask any questions. He did not look surprised. He did not look at me like I needed to prove anything. I slid into the seat, the door closing softly behind me, sealing off the sound of my family's voices like it belonged to a different life. As the car pulled away from the curb, I felt my phone vibrate again. A message from my mother. Where did you go? I stared at it for a moment. Then another message. Dinner is not over. Then a third. At least have the courtesy to say something. I did not reply. For once I did not explain myself. For once I did not apologize for leaving. The city lights blurred past the window as we drove, street signs and storefronts sliding by in streaks of yellow and white, and somewhere between the second red light and the entrance to the highway, something inside me shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. Enough to realize that maybe the question I had been asking all those years was wrong. Not what would it take for them to see me differently, but what would happen if I stopped waiting for them to see me at all. The driver's voice broke the silence. We will be there in 12 minutes. I nodded, even though he could not see me in the rearview mirror. 12 minutes. I pressed my hand lightly against my bag, feeling the outline of the folder inside. The one I had almost left at home. The one that had started all of this 3 months ago when an email I nearly deleted changed everything. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the hum of the engine settle into the background. I did not know exactly how the night would end. I did not know what my father would say when he saw me on that screen. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. By the time I walked back into that house, if I walked back at all, I would not be the version of me they had been so comfortable dismissing. And for the first time, that thought did not scare me. It steadied me. But what I did not realize yet was that the story they were about to see on that screen was not just about me. And when my name was called, it was going to expose something none of them had ever expected. The studio building looked smaller than I expected, almost ordinary, like it could have been any office complex off the highway. But the moment the car pulled into the lot and I saw the satellite trucks parked along the side with cables running like veins across the pavement, something inside me tightened again. Not with fear, but with the realization that this was real, that this was not something I could quietly step away from anymore. The driver opened my door and I stepped out, the cool night air sharper here, cleaner somehow, and for a second I just stood there, adjusting my bag on my shoulder, feeling the weight of the folder inside like it was the only thing anchoring me in place. A woman in a navy blazer was already walking toward me, heels clicking with purpose, her eyes scanning me quickly before settling into a small professional smile. Emily Carter? I nodded. Yes. She extended her hand. Rachel. We spoke on the phone. We are on a tight schedule, but we are very glad you made it. She did not ask if I was ready. She did not ask if I was nervous. She turned and I followed, through a set of glass doors that opened into a hallway buzzing with quiet urgency, people moving in different directions with headsets and clipboards, screens mounted on the walls showing live feeds, countdown timers, segments I had seen 100 times from my couch now unfolding just a few feet away from me. Makeup is optional, Rachel said as we walked, glancing at me briefly. Wardrobe cleared what you are wearing. We want you exactly as you are. Exactly as I am. No one in my family had ever said that to me. Not once. We turned a corner and entered a smaller room with a single chair, a mirror surrounded by bright lights, and a table with bottled water and neatly stacked papers. "You have about 20 minutes, she said, handing me a sheet. "We will go over the flow. It is mostly conversational, but there are a few points we want to make sure land clearly." I took the paper, my fingers brushing the printed text. My name at the top, bold and unmistakable. Emily Carter. Featured educator. Featured. The word felt unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else, someone who had spent years being introduced as an afterthought, as a quiet detail that did not need elaboration. I sat down slowly, the chair cool beneath me, and looked at the notes. Community Impact Initiative. Literacy rates improved by 40%. Student-led mentorship model. The numbers were there. The work was there. Everything I had spent the last 3 years building in classrooms that no one in my family had ever visited. In after-school programs I never mentioned because I knew how the conversation would end. "That is nice, Emily, but what is the long-term plan?" I had stopped trying to answer that question a long time ago. A knock on the door pulled me back. A man with a headset leaned in. "We are going to do a quick sound check in 5. I nodded, even though my throat felt suddenly dry. 5 minutes. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder, the edges slightly worn from how often I had carried it around without ever showing it to anyone at home. Inside were copies of emails, letters, recognition I had filed away quietly, not because I did not value them, but because I knew they would not change anything in that house. Or at least that is what I believed. My phone vibrated again, insistent this time. I looked down. 5 missed calls from my mother. 2 from my father. 1 message from Sophia. "Dad says you left. What is going on?" I locked the screen without responding. For once, I was not going to explain myself in advance, not going to soften the moment before it even happened. Rachel reappeared at the door. "Emily, we are ready for you." I stood up, smoothing my hands down the sides of my dress, taking one steady breath before stepping out into the hallway again. The lights seemed brighter now, the movement faster. Somewhere ahead, I could hear the faint echo of a host's voice, calm and practiced, introducing the next segment. Rachel leaned slightly closer as we walked. "When he says your name, just walk straight out and take the seat to his left. Do not worry about the cameras. Just focus on the conversation. Focus on the conversation." I nodded, but my mind had already jumped ahead, past the cameras, past the host, back to the living room I had just left, where the television was probably still on, where my father was probably still sitting in the same chair, completely certain that nothing about tonight would challenge what he believed about me. We stopped just short of the set, the bright light spilling into the hallway like a stage waiting for its cue. Rachel gave me one last look, quick but steady. "You are going to do great." I did not answer right away. I just looked past her, at the edge of the stage, at the place where I would be visible to millions of people in a matter of seconds, including the 2 people who had spent years deciding exactly how small I was supposed to be. I stepped forward when I heard my name begin to form in the host's voice, my heart steady in a way I did not expect, because what they did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that this moment was not the beginning of something new. It was the reveal of something I had been building all along. The moment my name left the host's mouth, everything else seemed to narrow into a single line of movement, one step forward, then another, the bright studio lights washing over me as I walked onto the set, the audience clapping politely, not knowing who I was yet, not knowing what they were about to hear, and I took my seat exactly where Rachel had told me to the host's left, my hands resting lightly in my lap, steady, even though my pulse had picked up just enough to remind me this was real. "Emily Carter," the host repeated with a warm smile, turning slightly toward me. "A public school teacher whose work has been gaining national attention for something quite extraordinary." National attention. I had heard those words before, in emails, in calls, in quiet conversations with people who understood what I was building, but hearing them spoken out loud, here in this room, carried a different weight. I nodded politely, the way I had been taught to, the way I had learned to navigate rooms where I did not quite belong. "Thank you for having me," I said, my voice coming out clearer than I expected. He leaned forward slightly, glancing at his notes. "Now, Emily, we have to start with this. 3 years ago, you started something in your classroom that most people would have said was too ambitious, maybe even unrealistic. Can you tell us what that was?" 3 years ago. My mind shifted, not away from the present, but deeper into it, pulling up the memory like it had been waiting for this exact moment. A classroom with chip desks. 30 students. Half of them reading below grade level. Some of them already convinced they were behind, that they would always be behind. I took a breath. I started a peer-led literacy program, I said. Students teaching students. Not just in my classroom but across the school. He raised his eyebrows slightly interested. Students teaching students. That sounds simple, but I imagine it was not. I shook my head, a small smile forming. It was not. At first, no one believed it would work. Not the administration. Not the parents. And honestly, not even some of the students. I paused, just for a second, the image of my father's face at the dinner table flashing in my mind, the way he had said those words so easily, so confidently. Just a lowly teacher. But they showed up anyway, I continued. Every day. They stayed after school. They helped each other. And over time something changed. The host leaned in slightly. Changed how? I met his eyes, steady now. Reading scores improved by 40% in 1 year. But more importantly, the students started to see themselves differently. They stopped thinking of themselves as the ones who were behind. They started thinking of themselves as capable. There was a small shift in the room then, subtle but real, the kind that happens when a story begins to land. The host nodded slowly. That is incredible. And this did not just stay in your classroom, correct? I shook my head. No. Other teachers started adopting the model. Then other schools reached out. It grew. Grew. That was the word I had used in emails, in grant applications, in late-night planning sessions at my kitchen table, long after my family had gone to bed in their own version of certainty. The host glanced briefly toward one of the cameras, then back at me. And that brings us to why you are here tonight. Because what started in one classroom is now being recognized at a national level. National level. The phrase echoed louder this time, not just in the room, but in the space I had left behind, in the living room where the television was almost certainly still on, where my father's voice had filled the air just hours ago, defining me in a single sentence. The host picked up a card from the table, his tone shifting slightly, more formal now. Emily, earlier this week, the National Education Foundation announced this year's recipient of their Innovation in Teaching Award, an honor given to one educator across the country whose work has demonstrated measurable impact and long-term potential. I felt my hands still in my lap, fingers lightly interlocked, the weight of the moment settling in, not overwhelming, just undeniable. He looked up from the card directly at me. And that recipient is you. The audience reacted first, a wave of applause rising around us, but I did not move right away, did not react the way they might have expected, because in that exact second my mind was not on the applause, not on the cameras, not even on the award itself, but on a single image, my father standing in the living room, the television casting light across his face, hearing those words and realizing for the first time that the version of me he had been so certain about did not exist the way he thought it did. I turned slightly toward the host, nodding once, composed, controlled, but inside something had shifted permanently, because what they did not know, what none of them could see from the outside, was that this moment was not just recognition, it was a line being drawn between who they believed I was and who I had already become. I smiled when the applause faded, but it was not the kind of smile I used at family dinners, not the polite one that filled silence or softened tension. It was smaller, steadier, the kind that came from knowing something had already shifted and could not be undone. Thank you, I said, my voice even, grounded, not rushed, not overwhelmed, because this was not a surprise to me, not really. I had lived inside this work for 3 years. I had seen it grow in real time, one student at a time, one small breakthrough after another, long before anyone decided it was worth putting on television. The host nodded, clearly expecting emotion, maybe even a little disbelief. Emily, this is a huge recognition. One educator in the entire country. What does this moment mean to you? I paused, not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted to choose it carefully. It means the students were right, I said. They believed in something before anyone else did. They showed up when it was uncertain. This recognition belongs to them just as much as it does to me. There was another shift in the room then, quieter this time but deeper, the kind that does not rely on applause. The host leaned back slightly, studying me in a way that felt different now, more attentive. You keep bringing it back to the students, he said. But someone had to start this. Someone had to take the risk. I nodded once. Yes, I said. But I did not start it because I thought it would lead here. I started it because I saw what happens when people are told over and over again that they are not enough. Eventually, they believe it. The words hung there for a second, simple, direct, but carrying more than what was being said out loud. I did not need to explain where that understanding came from. I did not need to say anything about dinner tables or labels or the quiet ways people decide who you are allowed to be. The host did not interrupt. For the first time since I had sat down, he gave me space to continue. I wanted them to see something different, I added. To see that they could lead, that they could teach, that they had value beyond what anyone had decided for them. I could feel it then, not just in the room but beyond it, in living rooms and kitchens and wherever people were watching, the story landing in a way that was not just about education anymore. The host glanced briefly toward the camera again, then back at me. We actually have a short clip, he said. This is from one of the schools that adopted your program earlier this year. A screen behind us lit up and for a second I saw it the way the audience did. A classroom. Not mine but familiar in every detail. Students standing at the front, explaining concepts to each other, pointing at whiteboards, laughing. When someone got something wrong and trying again anyway. No one looked small. No one looked like they were waiting to be told what they were worth. I watched quietly, my hands still in my lap, my chest tightening just slightly, not with anxiety but with recognition. This was it. This was the thing I had never been able to translate into a sentence my family would understand. When the clip ended, the audience responded again, softer this time but more sustained. The host turned back to me. Emily, I have to ask, he said, his tone shifting just enough to signal something more personal. Did you always know this was the path you wanted to take? I let out a small breath, not quite a laugh but close. No, I said honestly. For a long time I thought I needed to prove something else. Something bigger. Something that people would recognize more easily. He tilted his head slightly. What changed? I looked at him, then past him just for a fraction of a second, at the camera positioned slightly above eye level, the red light glowing steadily. Millions of people. Including the ones who had never once asked me that question. I realized, I said slowly, that the value of what you do does not come from how impressive it sounds to other people. It comes from the impact it has, even if that impact is not immediately visible. I could almost hear my father's voice in contrast, sharp, certain, reducing everything to a single line, a single label. Just a lowly teacher. I did not repeat it out loud. I did not need to. The difference between that sentence and this moment was already clear to anyone watching. The host nodded, thoughtful now. That is a powerful perspective, he said. And clearly it is one that is changing lives. I gave a small nod in return, but inside something settled into place with a clarity I had not felt before, because this was not just about being seen by an audience or recognized by an organization. It was about finally understanding that the version of me my family had held onto for so long was never the full story, and for the first time, I was no longer interested in correcting them gently or earning their approval quietly, because what they were watching now was not something I had become overnight, it was something I had been all along, and they had simply chosen not to see it. The host shifted slightly in his chair, glancing towards something off camera before returning his attention to me, and I could tell the segment was not over yet, not even close, because the tone had changed, less about what I had built and more about what it meant beyond the classroom. Emily, he said, there is something else our viewers should know. This program you created, it is not just being recognized. It is being funded. Funded. The word landed differently than everything else that had been said so far, heavier, more concrete, the kind of word my father respected, the kind of word that translated into numbers and decisions and things he could measure. I kept my expression steady, but my focus sharpened. The host continued, earlier today, the foundation announced a national expansion initiative, and they have committed $8.2 million to scale your model across multiple states over the next 2 years. $8.2 million. I heard it clearly, but it did not feel like something I owned, not in the way my father would define ownership. Felt like responsibility. Like reach. Like every late night, every early morning, every moment I chose to keep going when it would have been easier to stop had just expanded beyond anything I had planned for. The audience reacted again, a ripple of surprise moving through the room, but I stayed still, absorbing it, because this was the part no one at home had ever asked about. Not what do you do, but what does it become? The host leaned forward, clearly engaged now. And you are going to be leading that expansion, he added. Can you talk about what that looks like? I nodded slowly, choosing my words the same way I had in every grant proposal, every meeting, every conversation where I had to translate something real into something others could understand. It means building training programs for teachers in different districts, I said. It means creating systems that allow students to take ownership of their learning in ways that are sustainable. It means not just proving that this works in one place, but showing that it can work anywhere. He watched me closely. Anywhere, he repeated. I nodded. Anywhere that people are willing to believe that students are capable of more than what they have been told. There it was again, that quiet line beneath everything I said, the one that connected classrooms to something much closer to home. The host glanced briefly at his notes, then back at me, a small shift in his expression, something more curious now. I have to ask, he said, did the people closest to you support this from the beginning? The question hung in the air, simple on the surface, but carrying a weight that felt very different from anything else that had been asked so far. For a second I considered the easier answer. The polished one. The one that would keep everything neat and uncomplicated. But that was not why I was here. No, I said calmly, without hesitation. The word was not sharp. It was not defensive. It was just true. The audience quieted slightly, the shift almost immediate. The host nodded once, encouraging me to continue. Most people did not understand it at first, I added. It did not look impressive. It did not sound like something that would lead to recognition like this. It looked small. I paused, just long enough for the word to settle. Small. I knew that word. I had lived inside it for years. But small does not mean insignificant, I continued. Sometimes it just means people are not paying attention yet. The host leaned back slightly, studying me again. Not as someone being introduced, but as someone revealing something. That is a powerful distinction, he said quietly. I gave a small nod, but inside something else had started to take shape. Something I had not planned to say. Something that had been building since I stepped onto the set. Because this was the moment. Not the award. Not the funding. This question. This opening. I could feel it clearly now, the connection between the conversation happening here and the conversation that had happened just hours ago at that table, the one that had ended with a label that was supposed to define me. I looked directly at the host, then briefly toward the camera, aware of exactly who might be watching. There are people, I said slowly, who decide what something is worth based on how it sounds when you say it out loud. Teacher, banker, executive. And they assign value to those words before they ever look at the impact behind them. I did not raise my voice. I did not change my tone. But the room shifted again, deeper this time, because this was no longer just about education. But the reality is, I continued, the title does not determine the value. The work does. I could feel it then, not just in the studio but beyond it, the weight of that sentence landing wherever it was heard, including the place I had just left, where a man who had spent years defining me by a single word was now hearing that word reframed in a way he could not control. The host did not interrupt. He let the silence hold for a second longer than usual, then nodded slowly. Emily, he said. That is something I think a lot of people needed to hear. I gave a small, steady nod in return, but inside I knew this was only part of it, because what they did not know yet, what no one in that room had asked, was why I had kept all of this separate from my own family for so long. And that answer was about to matter more than anything else I had said tonight. I did not look away from the camera right after I said it, because for the first time in my life, I was not measuring my words against how they would be received at that dinner table. I was letting them stand on their own, complete, without adjustment, without softening, and that alone felt unfamiliar in a way I could not ignore. The host shifted slightly, his expression thoughtful, but there was something else now. A kind of awareness that the conversation had moved beyond the expected structure of a segment about education. You mentioned something just now, he said carefully, about how people assign value before they understand the impact. That sounds personal. It was not a question, not exactly, but it opened a space that had not been there before. I could have stepped around it. I could have redirected back to the program, the numbers, the expansion. That would have been easier. That would have been safer. But I had not come here to repeat the same patterns that had kept everything separate for so long. It is, I said simply. No hesitation. No explanation yet. Just enough. The room quieted again, the kind of quiet that does not come from confusion, but from attention. The host nodded slightly, giving me room to continue, and for a brief second, I felt the weight of two timelines overlapping, the one I was sitting in now, under bright lights, and the one from just a few hours ago, sitting at that table, hearing the same sentence that had been repeated in different forms for years. I took a breath, not to steady myself, but to choose clarity over comfort. I think a lot of people grow up in environments where their value is measured in very specific ways, I said. Income, titles, visibility, things that are easy to point to and say this matters. I paused just enough for the words to settle, and anything outside of that can feel smaller, less important. The host watched me closely, not interrupting, not pushing, just listening, which made it easier to keep going, to stay in the truth instead of stepping back from it. For a long time, I continued, I thought I needed to translate what I was doing into something that fit those definitions. Something that would be recognized more quickly, more easily. I could feel it again, that familiar tension, not in my voice, but in the memory itself, the years of adjusting, explaining, minimizing, trying to make something meaningful sound impressive enough to be taken seriously. But the problem with that, I said, is that you start measuring your work by standards that were never designed to understand it. The host leaned in slightly, clearly engaged now. And when did that shift for you? He asked. I let out a small breath, thinking back, not to a single moment, but to a pattern, a slow accumulation of realizations that did not arrive all at once. It did not happen all at once, I said. It was gradual. It was watching students who had been told they were behind start to lead. It was seeing confidence build in places where it had never been before. It was realizing that impact does not always look impressive from the outside, but it changes everything from the inside. I paused again, and this time I did let the silence sit for a second longer, because what I was about to say next was not just about classrooms anymore. And eventually, I added, I stopped trying to prove that it mattered to people who had already decided it did not. The sentence was simple, but it carried something sharper underneath it, something that did not need to be explained out loud to be understood. The host did not respond immediately. He nodded once, slowly, as if recognizing the weight of what had just been said. That is not an easy shift to make, he said quietly. I gave a small shake of my head. No, I said. It is not. Especially when those people are the ones closest to you. There it was. Not detailed. Not dramatic. But clear. The room shifted again, deeper this time, because now the story had a different center, one that extended beyond the program, beyond the award, into something more personal, something more familiar to anyone who had ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to know them best. The host glanced briefly toward the camera, then back at me, his tone softer now. Do they know? He asked. I held his gaze for a second, then let a small, almost imperceptible smile form. They are finding out, I said. Not defensive. Not emotional. Just true. Because somewhere, in a living room I knew better than this studio, a television was still on, and two people who had spent years defining me in a single sentence were now hearing something they could not interrupt, could not reframe, could not dismiss in the same way. And for the first time I was not the one explaining it to them. But what I did not know yet, what I had not considered in that moment, was how they were reacting on the other side of that screen, and that reaction was already beginning to change everything. Inside the living room, the television volume had been turned up higher than usual, not because anyone had said to do it, but because no one wanted to miss a single word, and for the first time in years the center of attention in that house was not sitting at the head of the table, it was standing under studio lights miles away. My father had not moved from his chair since my name was first spoken, his posture still, his glass untouched in his hand, the ice inside it long melted, while my mother stood just a few feet behind him, arms crossed tightly, like she was trying to hold onto something that was already slipping. Sophia had stopped scrolling her phone halfway through the segment, her screen gone dark in her lap, her attention fixed entirely on the television in a way I had never seen before. That is her, my mother said quietly at first, almost like she needed to confirm it out loud, like saying it would make it less unexpected. That is Emily. My father did not answer right away. He just watched, his eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, not exactly, but in something closer to recalculation, like he was trying to fit what he was seeing into a version of reality that no longer held together the same way. On the screen I was speaking calmly, confidently, not rushing, not shrinking, not adjusting myself to fit into the space I was given, and that alone was enough to disrupt everything they thought they knew. 8.2 million, Sophia said under her breath, almost to herself, like she was testing the number, weighing it, translating it into something she understood. My father finally shifted in his chair, setting his glass down on the table with a small, controlled motion. "It is a grant," he said, his tone measured, almost dismissive, but not quite as certain as it had been earlier that night. "It is not the same as—" He stopped mid-sentence, not finishing it, because whatever comparison he had been about to make no longer fit as easily as it used to. My mother stepped closer, her eyes still on the screen. "They said national expansion," she added, her voice tighter now, less composed. "Multiple states." There was a pause, not the comfortable kind, but the kind that fills a room when something has shifted and no one knows how to respond to it yet. On the television, the host was listening, nodding, giving me space to speak, treating me like someone whose words carried weight, and that contrast, that difference between how I was being seen there and how I had been seen here just hours ago, was becoming impossible to ignore. "Why did she not tell us?" Sophia asked suddenly, her voice sharper now, cutting through the quiet. It was not concern. It was something closer to disbelief. My father leaned back slightly, his expression tightening just enough to show that the question had landed somewhere he was not prepared to address. "Because," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully now, "she probably knew we would not understand it." The sentence hung there, unexpected, heavier than anything he had said all evening, because it was the first time he had acknowledged, even indirectly, that the problem might not have been what I was doing, but how they had chosen to see it. My mother turned toward him slightly, surprised, but before she could respond, my voice came through the television again, steady, clear, impossible to ignore. And eventually, I stopped trying to prove that it mattered to people who had already decided it did not. The room went completely still. No one spoke. No one moved. The words were not directed at them specifically, not by name, but they landed exactly where they needed to, cutting through years of assumptions in a way no argument ever had. Sophia shifted in her seat, her posture no longer relaxed, her expression harder to read now. My mother lowered her arms slowly, her eyes fixed on the screen in a way that looked less like observation and more like recognition. And my father, for the first time that night, did not look like he had something to say. He just watched. Because what they were seeing was not a version of me they could interrupt or correct or redefine in the moment. It was complete. It was public. And it was being validated by something far beyond their reach. The television light flickered slightly across the room as the segment continued, but the atmosphere had already changed, permanently, because what had started as a simple dinner conversation had turned into something none of them could control anymore. And for the first time, they were not the ones deciding what I was worth. They were the ones trying to understand it after the fact, and that realization was only just beginning to settle in. Back in the studio, the conversation had shifted again, but I could feel something different now, something quieter beneath the surface, like the room itself was holding on to what had already been said, letting it settle before moving forward. The host adjusted slightly in his seat, glancing toward the monitor for a brief second before returning his attention to me, and there was a subtle change in his tone when he spoke again, less formal, more deliberate. "Emily," he said, "there is something we have not talked about yet, and I think it matters." I nodded once, waiting. He leaned forward just enough to signal this was not part of the usual script. "You built this quietly. You scaled it quietly. You received recognition before tonight. Why keep it separate from your personal life for so long?" The question landed clean, direct, without decoration, and for a moment everything slowed, not around me but within me, because this was the question that connected everything: the work, the silence, the distance, the years of choosing not to share something that had defined me more than anything else. I could have answered it in a sentence. I could have made it simple. But it was not simple. It had never been simple. "Because," I said slowly, "I learned early on that not everything you build will be understood by the people closest to you." I kept my voice even, not defensive, not emotional, just clear. And sometimes, when something matters enough, you protect it from being reduced before it has the chance to grow. The host did not interrupt. He did not rush me. He let the words hold their space, and I could feel the weight of them extending beyond the studio, reaching into places where similar decisions had been made quietly, without announcement. If I had explained it too early, I continued, it would have been measured by the wrong standards. It would have been compared to things it was never meant to compete with. I paused just briefly, and eventually I realized that I did not need validation in real time. I needed results. Results. The word felt solid, grounded, something that did not shift based on opinion or perception. The host nodded slowly, understanding more now, not just the outcome but the process behind it. So you waited, he said. You built it until it could speak for itself. I gave a small nod. Yes. He leaned back slightly, studying me in a way that felt less like an interview and more like recognition. That takes a level of discipline most people do not have, he said. I did not respond right away because discipline was not the word I would have chosen. It had not felt like discipline at the time. It had felt like necessity. It takes clarity, I said instead, about what matters and what does not. The host smiled slightly, then glanced toward the camera again, aware of the time but not rushing the moment. I think a lot of people watching right now are going to recognize themselves in that, he said. I did not look at the camera this time. I did not need to. I knew exactly where those words were landing. Somewhere in that living room the same question was being asked, just in a different form. Why did she not tell us? Why did we not know? But the answer was already on the screen, in every sentence, in every pause, in everything that had been built without their involvement. The host picked up the card again, then set it down, choosing not to read from it. Before we close, he said, I want to ask you one last thing. His tone shifted again, softer now, more reflective. If you could say something to the version of yourself who was just starting this, before any recognition, before any support, what would it be? The question was simple, but it reached further back than anything else he had asked. I took a breath, not because I needed to think, but because I wanted to answer it without filtering it through anything else, without adjusting it for anyone watching. I would tell her, I said, that being underestimated is not a disadvantage unless you believe it is. I paused, letting the sentence settle. It gives you time, gives you space. It lets you build without interruption. The host nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. And I would tell her, I continued, that one day the same people who overlooked her will have to reassess everything they thought they knew. I did not raise my voice. I did not look away. I let the words stand exactly as they were, complete, without explanation, because they did not need it. The host let out a small breath, almost a quiet acknowledgement of the moment. Emily Carter, he said. Thank you for being here and congratulations again. I nodded once. Thank you. The cameras began to pull back slightly, the segment coming to a close, but I did not move right away because even as the lights shifted and the conversation ended, I knew something else was just beginning, something that had nothing to do with the studio and everything to do with what was waiting on the other side of that screen, where silence had already turned into something else, something that would not stay contained much longer. The moment the cameras cut and the studio lights softened, the room shifted from performance to motion, people stepping in, voices overlapping, headsets buzzing with the next segment already lining up. But I stayed seated for a second longer than necessary, my hand still resting in my lap, letting the quiet after the conversation settle into something real, something I could carry with me beyond this room. That was excellent. Rachel's voice came from just off to my right, calm but unmistakably impressed, and I turned slightly as she approached, her clipboard now tucked under her arm. You were clear, you were grounded, and you did not let them rush you. I nodded once, a small acknowledgement, because what she described did not feel like something I had done intentionally. It felt like something I had finally stopped holding back. I stood up slowly, adjusting the strap of my bag on my shoulder, the familiar weight of it grounding me again as the energy of the studio moved around me. Your phone has been going off, she added, almost as an afterthought, but her tone suggested she already knew what that meant. I did not reach for it immediately. I did not need to. I already knew who it would be. The hallway outside the set felt different now, not quieter but more focused, like I was moving through it with a clearer sense of direction than when I arrived. People nodded as I passed, some offering brief congratulations, others just a quick smile, the kind that comes from recognition, not obligation. Recognition. That word had followed me all night, But it felt different here than it did in my own house. Here it was based on something I had done. There, it had always been based on what I had not. I stepped into the smaller room where I had waited earlier, closing the door behind me just enough to create a pocket of stillness, and only then did I pull my phone out of my bag. 12 missed calls. 8 messages. The names were exactly what I expected. Mom. Dad. Sophia. I stared at the screen for a moment, not overwhelmed, not surprised, just aware that whatever conversation had been avoided for years was no longer optional. The first message was from my mother. Emily, call us. We just saw you. The second came less than a minute later. We need to talk. My father's message was shorter. Where are you? No question mark. Just a statement like location was the only detail that mattered. Sophia's message was different. Why did you not tell us? I read that one twice, not because I did not understand it, but because of how familiar it felt, the assumption that information should have been shared, that they were entitled to it, even after years of showing me exactly how it would have been received. I locked the screen again without responding. Not yet. Not like this. A knock on the door pulled my attention back. Rachel leaned in slightly. Car is ready whenever you are, she said. I nodded. Thank you. As I stepped back into the hallway, the movement of the studio no longer felt overwhelming. It felt distant, like something I had already moved through. The exit doors opened automatically as I approached, the night air cooler now, quieter than before, the hum of the building fading behind me as I stepped outside. The car was waiting in the same spot, engine idling, the driver stepping out as soon as he saw me. All set, he asked. I paused for just a second before answering, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that the next part of this night was not going to look anything like the last. Yes, I said finally. All set. I slid into the back seat, the door closing softly behind me, and as the car pulled away from the curb, my phone vibrated again in my hand, persistent now, insistent in a way it had never been before. I looked down at the screen, at the names that had defined so much of my life, and for the first time, I did not feel the immediate pull to respond, to explain, to smooth things over before they became uncomfortable. Instead, I let the phone rest in my hand, unanswered, as the city lights passed by outside the window in steady lines of white and yellow. Because the truth was, whatever they were ready to say now, whatever questions they had, whatever version of me they were trying to understand in this moment, it was coming after something had already changed, something they had not been part of, something they could not go back and reshape. And as the car merged onto the highway, the distance between where I had been and where I was going stretched out in front of me, clear and uninterrupted, I realized that this conversation, when it happened, was not going to be about proving anything anymore. It was going to be about deciding what I was willing to accept from the people who had once decided what I was worth, and that decision, for the first time, was entirely mine. The highway stretched out in front of us in long, steady lines, the kind that made everything feel quieter than it actually was, and for a while I just watched the lights pass by without thinking about where we were going, because for the first time that night, there was nothing immediate demanding my attention, no questions I had to answer, no expectations I had to meet, just space, and that alone felt unfamiliar enough to notice. My phone vibrated again in my hand, sharper this time, persistent, and I finally looked down at the screen as it lit up with my father's name calling through. Not a message, not a question, a call. I let it ring for a second longer than I normally would have, my thumb hovering over the screen, not hesitating out of fear, but out of clarity, because I knew this conversation was not going to sound the way it always had. I answered. Hello. There was no greeting on his end. No pause. Just his voice, direct, controlled, but carrying something underneath it that had not been there before. Where are you? The same question from the message, but this time it was not about location. It was about distance. I leaned back slightly in the seat, my voice even. I am on my way home. A brief silence followed, shorter than usual, like he was recalibrating in real time. We just saw you, he said. Not accusation. Not praise. Just a statement, but the edges of it were different now, less certain. I know, I replied. Another pause. Longer this time. Why did you not tell us? He asked, and there it was, the question that had been building all night, the same one Sophia had sent, but heavier here, more direct, more loaded with everything that had gone unsaid for years. I looked out the window for a second, watching the reflection of passing headlights move across the glass before answering. Because you would not have listened, I said. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush the words. I let them land exactly as they were. There was a shift on the other end of the line, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable, like something had just been placed in front of him that he could not easily move around. That is not true, he said quickly, almost instinctively. I did not interrupt. I let the sentence exist on its own for a second before responding. It is, I said. Calm, steady, final. Another silence followed, longer now, and I could hear something in it, not anger, not exactly, but something closer to realization, something that did not have an immediate response. You should have said something, he added, but the certainty was gone from his voice, replaced with something quieter, something that sounded more like what he thought he should say than what he fully believed. I shifted slightly in my seat, the movement small but grounding. I did, I said. For years. That stopped him. Completely. No response. No correction. Just silence, the kind that only happens when a pattern is named out loud in a way it has never been before. I could almost see it, the memory of every time I had tried to explain what I was doing, every time it had been reduced to something smaller, something less important, something that did not fit into the structure he understood. Emily, he said finally, and this time my name sounded different, less like a label, more like an attempt to reach something he did not fully recognize yet. This is significant. Significant. The word felt almost unfamiliar coming from him, like he was borrowing language he had not used for me before. I nodded slightly, even though he could not see me. Yes, I said. It is. Another pause. We need to talk when you get back, he said, and for the first time it sounded less like a directive and more like a request, even if he had not fully realized it yet. I considered that for a second, not because I did not expect it, but because I understood what that conversation would represent, not just a reaction to what they had seen, but a shift in something much deeper, something that had been in place for a long time. We will, I said. Simple. Clear. Not immediate. Not delayed. Just acknowledged. He did not respond right away, and when he did, his voice was quieter than before. All right. The call ended without anything else, no closing statement, no attempt to regain control of the conversation, just a line going silent in a way I had never heard from him before. I lowered the phone slowly, resting it in my lap, and for a moment I just sat there letting the quiet of the car settle around me again. But it felt different now, not empty, not uncertain, but open, like something that had been fixed in place for years had finally shifted just enough to create space for something else. And as the city lights continued to pass by outside the window, I realized that whatever conversation was waiting when I walked back into that house, it was not going to follow the same pattern it always had, because for the first time, I was not walking in as the version of myself they had defined, I was walking in as someone they were just beginning to understand, and that difference was going to matter more than anything either of us had said so far. When the car finally turned onto my street, everything looked exactly the same as it had a few hours ago. The same row of houses, the same porch lights casting soft yellow circles onto the pavement, the same quiet stillness that usually meant nothing had changed, but tonight it felt different, like the air itself was holding on to something unspoken, something waiting. The car slowed as it pulled up in front of the house, and for a moment, I did not reach for the door handle right away. I just sat there looking at the front window where the light was still on, where shadows moved faintly behind the curtains, and I knew they were waiting. Not casually, not passively, waiting in a way they never had before. We are here, the driver said gently, his voice pulling me back into the moment. I nodded once. Thank you. He stepped out and opened the door, and as I stood up, adjusting my bag on my shoulder, I felt it again. Not nerves, not exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes right before something shifts permanently. The walk up the front steps felt longer than it should have. Each step measured, steady, not rushed, because I understood that once I walked through that door, there was no going back to the version of this house I had left earlier that evening. I reached for the handle, paused for just a second, then turned it. The door opened quietly, the familiar creak softer than I remembered, and the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the usual background noise of conversation or television, but a complete, deliberate stillness. They were all there. My father standing near the center of the room, not seated this time. My mother just behind him, her hands clasped together tightly. Sophia on the couch, leaning forward slightly, her phone forgotten beside her. No one spoke right away. They just looked at me. Not past me. Not through me. At me. It was a different kind of attention than I had ever received in this room, and it made the space feel unfamiliar in a way I could not ignore. I closed the door behind me slowly, the soft click echoing more than it should have, and set my bag down by the entry table, the motion deliberate, controlled, giving myself a second. Before stepping fully into the moment, my father was the first to speak. "You should have told us," he said, his voice steady but not sharp, not cutting the way it had earlier that night. I met his gaze directly. "I tried," I said. No hesitation. No explanation beyond that. The words landed differently now, not as a defense, but as a statement of fact that did not need to be argued. He held my gaze for a second longer than usual, and I could see it, the shift, not complete, not comfortable but undeniable, like he was looking at something he did not fully understand yet. My mother stepped forward slightly, her voice softer. "Emily, we did not know," she said, and there was something in it that had not been there before, not just confusion, but something closer to regret, even if she had not named it yet. I nodded once, acknowledging it without accepting it fully. "I know," I said. Sophia stood up from the couch, crossing her arms loosely, not defensive but not relaxed either. "This is a big deal," she said, her tone measured, like she was trying to find the right angle, the right way to approach something that did not fit into her usual framework. "The funding, the expansion, the recognition, you could have included us." I looked at her for a second, then back at both of them, letting the question sit between us before answering. "Included you how?" I asked. Not challenging. Not emotional. Just clear. The room shifted again, quieter now, because that was not the response they expected. My father inhaled slightly, as if preparing to answer, but then stopped, the words not forming as easily as they usually did. For so long the roles had been defined clearly. They asked. I explained. They evaluated. I adjusted. But that structure did not hold anymore. "We are your family," my mother said finally, her voice more certain now, reaching for something familiar. I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said. "You are." I paused just long enough for the next sentence to carry its full weight. "But being my family does not mean you get to define what matters to me." No raised voice. No anger. Just clarity. It settled into the room in a way nothing else had that night, because it was not reactive, it was foundational, something that had been missing for years now stated out loud. My father looked at me differently then, not dismissive, not corrective, but searching, like he was trying to understand where this version of me had come from. "That is not what we were doing," he said, but even as he said it, the certainty was gone, replaced with something less solid. I did not argue. I did not list examples. I did not revisit every moment that had led here. I just held the space steady, letting the reality of what had happened speak for itself. Because what they were facing now was not something they could debate or reinterpret in the moment. It had already happened. It had already been seen. And for the first time, the conversation was not about convincing them of anything. It was about whether they were willing to see what had been there all along, and that was not something I could control anymore. No one spoke right away after that. The silence did not feel empty this time. It felt full, like every word that had not been said over the years had finally found its place without needing to be repeated. My father looked at me in a way I had never seen before, not with evaluation, not with quiet dismissal, but with something closer to uncertainty, like he was standing in front of something that did not fit into the structure he had relied on for so long. My mother shifted slightly beside him, her hands loosening just enough to show that whatever she had been holding onto was no longer as steady as it used to be. Sophia stayed where she was, her arms no longer crossed, her posture less guarded, but still searching for something familiar in a situation that was no longer predictable. "Emily," my father said finally, and this time my name carried a weight it had never held before, not as a label, not as a category, but as something he was trying to understand. "What do you want us to say?" The question was simple, but it changed everything because it was not an assumption, not a correction, not a conclusion. It was a request. I looked at him for a moment, letting that settle, because for years, I had been the one trying to find the right words, the right explanation, the right version of myself that would make sense to them. And now for the first time he was asking. I took a slow breath, not to steady myself, but to answer honestly without shrinking it into something easier to accept. I do not need you to say anything, I said. Calm, clear, complete. My mother's expression shifted, a small flicker of something like confusion crossing her face. Then what do you want? She asked, her voice softer now, less certain, like she was stepping into unfamiliar ground. I held her gaze for a second before answering. I want you to understand, I said, that what I do matters, even if it does not look the way you expected it to. I paused, just long enough for the words to land without rushing past them. And I want you to stop deciding what something is worth before you actually see it. The room went still again, but this time it was different. Not tense. Not uncertain. Just quiet in a way that allowed the truth of what had been said to exist without interruption. My father exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, and I could see it, the shift happening in real time, not dramatic, not complete, but real. We were wrong, he said. The words were not loud. They were not polished. But they were direct, and they carried something I had never heard from him before. Not authority. Not certainty. Accountability. My mother looked at him, surprised, then back at me, her expression softening in a way that felt unfamiliar. We did not see it, she added quietly. I nodded once, acknowledging it, not absorbing it, not letting it rewrite everything that had come before, but letting it exist as what it was. Sophia took a small step forward, her voice measured, more careful than I had ever heard it. You built all of that without us, she said, not accusing, not defensive, just stating what had finally become clear. I met her gaze. Yes, I said. I did. Another pause followed, but this one felt different. Less like something breaking and more like something resetting. My father looked at me again, and this time there was no attempt to place me into a category, no quick summary, no label waiting to be used. Just a question forming slowly. What happens next? He asked. I let out a small breath, not a sigh, not a release, just a moment of clarity before answering. I keep doing the work, I said. The expansion starts next quarter. There are new schools, new teams, more students. I paused, then added, and I decide what role you have in that, if any. The words were not harsh. They were not meant to punish. They were simply the truth, stated without hesitation, without apology. And for the first time no one argued. No one corrected. No one tried to reframe it into something more comfortable. They just listened. Because the balance had shifted, not suddenly, not dramatically, but permanently, and everyone in that room could feel it. I picked up my bag from the table, the familiar weight of it grounding me again, and moved toward the stairs, not rushing, not waiting for permission, just continuing forward. Halfway up, I paused for a second, not turning around but aware of the room behind me, the people who were still standing in a version of the past that no longer held the same power. That night changed everything, I said quietly, more to myself than to them, but loud enough to be heard, because it was true in a way that did not need to be explained. And as I continued up the stairs, leaving the lights of the living room behind me, I realized that for the first time in my life, I was not walking away from something. I was walking forward into something that was entirely mine, something no one else could define, reduce, or take from me, no matter how they had seen me before.